Okay, our next guest should be no stranger to many of you at Citizens Climate Lobby as well. It's Darrin Qualman from the National Farmers Union, and he's the Climate Policy Director. We're starting off with a big picture today, and when he showed me his talk about energy flows on the planet and how we have to close loops is how I summarize it. I knew I needed for you all to see it, because we're seeing the big picture really helps us understand the very detailed work we do. So without any ado, I would like to hand the microphone over to Darrin.
Thank you, Kathy. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you perfectly. You look great too.
Thanks so much. It's just going to take a second here to share my screen properly. Are you seeing my slides advance? You are? Very good. And you're just seeing the one slide. I'm in presentation mode? Okay, I'll launch right in then. As Kathy said, I'm going to give a big picture analysis of the emissions from the Canadian food system, look at energy, carbon, sustainability, and then end with a discussion of how carbon pricing and levies can fit in. And just to say, I'm tremendously pleased to have this opportunity to speak, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm a former farmer. I've fed cattle and cropped about 4,000 acres through the 90s. And I'm now doing work full-time on trying to work with people to find ways to move to a lower emission food system. So 6 quick parts in my presentation, just so you can sort of stay on track with where we're going. I'm going to start with the particular, which is a slightly detailed look at agricultural emissions. Then I'm going to talk about agriculture and emissions more generally, talk about our civilization and its emissions, and give you, I hope, some foundational ways of thinking about the emissions and emission reduction predicament we are in. So I'll start with this graph. This is the most detailed picture of Canadian agricultural emissions so far assembled. We put this out a month ago. It covers the period 1990 to 2019, so just about 30 years. It has every kind of agricultural emission and emission from the production of inputs, about 40 categories in all, but no need to go into all those details. You can see there are 3 main categories: the blue, the green, and the red. So the blue at the bottom is emissions from cattle and manure. The green in the middle are emissions from nitrogen fertilizer production and use, and the red at the top are emissions from farm fuels. So just a few takeaways from this graph. First, what's obvious: emissions are rising. Agricultural emissions, the emissions from the farms and food systems in Canada, went from 66 million tons in 1990 up to 84 million today. So the trend line is going in the wrong direction if we're going to contribute to meeting any of our commitments, a la Paris, etc. Second thing I'll mention is the main driver for that increase in the total, the top line rising. The main driver is the increase in emissions from nitrogen fertilizer. And I'm going to talk a lot about nitrogen in this talk. So the reason the top line is going up isn't because cattle emissions and manure emissions are going up. They're in fact going down in recent years. And it's not necessarily because farm fuel use is going up. That's up a little bit. But the main driver is that those green bands getting wider and wider. And the last thing I'll note on this graph are the dotted lines at the bottom. Those dotted lines represent the capture of carbon into the soil. You may have heard the term soil carbon sequestration. Some people are very, very, very bullish on soil carbon sequestration. They claim if we farm differently, we can fix the climate crisis. I would suggest that they are a little too zealous in their advocacy here. I think that the data here shows that emissions from Canadian agriculture are about 84 million tons, but that gray dotted line at the bottom is about 6 million tons going the other way. So that soil carbon sequestration is equal to about 7% of agricultural emissions and just 1% of total Canadian emissions. So really, there's not a path where farm soils make a large contribution to net zero, even if you double or triple the rate that farmers are managing to capture carbon. I wish there were easier answers there, but I think we have to put that on the table so that we focus on what's really needed, and that is actually reducing emissions from fossil fuels rather than somehow pretending that we can emit and then capture it in the soil later. I mentioned the green bands are getting wider. The emissions are going up because emissions from nitrogen fertilizer are going up. This is a graph not of emissions, but of the actual tonnage of fertilizer used in Canada. You can see a very strong upward trend over the last 50 years. Farmers have doubled the amount of nitrogen fertilizer they are using since 1993. And any of you who have worked in sustainability will recognize these kinds of increases. As humans in our economy, we are doubling and redoubling our use of everything, and not surprisingly, nitrogen fertilizer included. The connection between nitrogen and emissions. Nitrogen is a fossil fuel product. Nitrogen is perhaps the most critical feedstock for modern agriculture, but it's also a fossil fuel product. It's made largely from natural gas. If you went to a nitrogen fertilizer production plant, you'd see a big natural gas pipe going in one side and a nitrogen gas and hydrous ammonia pipe coming out the other side. It's the main cost of making that fertilizer. And nitrogen fertilizer is so energy intensive that by the time you get it into the field and applied, 1 ton of nitrogen fertilizer has the embodied energy of 2 tons of gasoline. And the final thing I'll say on that front is nitrogen fertilizer is unique among all human processes and products in that it manages to make itself a large source of all 3 of the main greenhouse gases. So from its upstream natural gas supply, nitrogen fertilizer is a significant source of methane. In its production in the fertilizer factories, and we're about to see one here in a moment, it's a large source of carbon dioxide. And in the field, it gives off nitrous oxide. So it's a significant contributor of methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. And these are significant, large emissions. This is a picture of the Koch brothers nitrogen fertilizer plant just outside of Brandon, Manitoba. You're looking at the largest single source of greenhouse gases in the entire province of Manitoba. So these are not small emissions. So there's a lot of detail in the preceding graph, 39 categories of emissions in total. And we can simplify down 3 main groupings: on-farm energy use, nitrogen fertilizer, and cattle and their manure. But we can simplify more. We can drill down deeper, come up with a more powerful understanding. And one way to do that is to ask a question that we often don't ask, and that is, why are there agricultural emissions at all? So part of the reason is, why are there agricultural emissions at all, is because we've made agriculture into a linear system. And briefly, if you think about the biosphere, if you think about agriculture, traditionally, everything moved in a circle. There's the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, which is essentially hydrogen and oxygen. On the farms, the farm produced the energy to run the farm. The seeds that grew the crop came from the previous crop. The fertility that went into the land came off the land, and the livestock that fed on the land. In traditional agricultural systems, everything moved in a circle. In the biosphere, everything moves in a circle. Loops are the fundamental patterns of the earth, and were the fundamental patterns of human systems until the last 100 to 200 years. And then we did something that had never been done on the earth before. We supplanted those circular flows of nature and early human systems with the linear flows of petro-industrial capitalism. So that's this transfer to linear systems. We took those circular flows that characterized agriculture for thousands of years. We took those circular flows, we cracked them open, we stretched them out, we made them linear, and we stuffed millions of tons of material into one end in order to push millions of tons of food out the other. So Why are there agricultural emissions at all? Because we've made our systems linear. We're pushing inputs into one end of these linear systems to push food out the other end, and we're pushing out a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So key to understand is the tonnage of greenhouse gas emissions coming out of agriculture is a direct function of the tonnage going in. It's a linear system. If you've got stuff coming out the output end, it's because you're pushing stuff in to the input end. So here's a provocative idea, but one I hope that can begin to illuminate both the problem and the solutions. Agriculture does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions. We know this for sure, without a doubt, 100%, because we have 10,000 years of data. Humans have been farming for 10,000 years, and they haven't affected the climate or the atmosphere until recently. Then, about 100 years ago, we began pushing ever increasing quantities of inputs into our agricultural system, and the result has been ever rising emissions. Therefore, it follows inescapably that any low emission food system will have to be a low input food system. And that's really key. There's a lot of complexity in terms of emissions and emission reduction in agriculture. But when you start to understand that the emissions are a function of the inputs, you realize you have to move to lower emission systems. So let me broaden this a little bit to other aspects of the life that you intersect with. So far I've talked a lot about agriculture, but I want to shift gears now and look at our society and economy as a whole. I want to zoom out and look at all the systems of production and consumption and also energy supply. Because that loop breaking, that linearization that I highlighted in agriculture is not just confined to food production, it's in every part of our civilization. And it's really foundational to the work you're doing to sort of understand and reduce emissions. Everywhere we've replaced circular systems with linear. So I just want to do this by sort of distilling these things into a few key insights. So the first one is the material flows in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century are linear flows. And this is new, and that's really important to recognize. There's something new under the sun. This is unprecedented. Before 1850, the material flows of nature and most human systems were circular. Excuse me. For billions of years, the biosphere operated and everything moved in a circle: nitrogen, phosphorus, water, carbon, what have you. And because human systems emerged out of and were dependent upon those natural systems, those were also the patterns of early human systems. But then we changed all that and we created these linear systems. Second key insight, atoms are indestructible. Many molecules persist. You've heard of persistent pollutants, plastic persists. A lot of the molecules we create also persist. And everything ends up somewhere. Everything you push into one end of these linear systems comes out the other end and ends up somewhere. So when we put those two insights together, what we realize is if we push billions of tons of indestructible atoms and persistent molecules into one end of our linear systems, they will come out the other end. So what this allows us to understand is we don't have a bunch of problems. We have one problem that then creates a whole bunch of different symptoms. And these are all related: climate change, ocean dead zones, algae clogged lakes, oceans full of plastics, accumulating toxicity, resource depletion, deforestation. It's not a bunch of different problems. It's a bunch of problems created when you linearize these systems that should be circular. When you stuff a bunch of stuff into one end and a bunch of stuff comes out the other end, because at one end you get depletion, like deforestation and depletion of resources, and at the other end you get accumulation, aka pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. So again, atoms are indestructible, whether they be carbon, nitrogen, or phosphorus atoms, and all the atoms we push in to our linear systems come out the other end. So we push in carbon atoms in the form of fossil fuels, and carbon atoms come out in the form of CO2, and you end up with climate change and ocean acidification. I think you've probably all seen versions of this graph, 800,000 years of atmospheric concentrations, and the post 1900 spike is very, very observable. Again, you push in carbon atoms in fossil fuels and other sources, and they come out as carbon atoms in methane. That also leads to climate change. Methane is a greenhouse gas 30 times more powerful than CO2.
Excuse me for a moment, Darrin. I terribly apologize for interrupting. Apparently, your slides are no longer advancing.
Thanks for letting me know.
For the viewer. Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, you're completely right.
We got about 4 flipped through there. Thanks.
Sorry, I don't know what happened exactly. So we push in carbon in the form of methane, and natural gas is mostly methane, and it comes out as climate change. And here's a graph of the methane concentration in the atmosphere. Methane is greenhouse gas 28 times more powerful than CO2. This isn't 800,000 years of methane, it's short term, only 10,000 years. But you can see the tripling of the atmospheric concentration of methane since 1800. The human impact there is very evident. 9,900 years of nearly flatline, and then 100 or 200 years of a tremendous spike. Moving from carbon to nitrogen, nitrogen atoms go in the form of nitrogen fertilizer, and nitrogen atoms come out as nitrous oxide and other nitrogen compounds, and we end up with climate change, ocean dead zones, terrestrial ecosystem damage. This is a key study from 2009, Johan Rockström and Will Steffen in the journal Nature. They popularized these ideas of the safe operating space for humanity and planetary boundaries. And I'll just zoom in on that graph. The green area near the middle is the safe operating space for planet Earth. And the edge of that green shows the planetary boundary. And there's 2 places where humans have pushed farthest past those planetary boundaries, where they've exited the safe operating space and gone deep into the unsafe space. And most people could guess one, and that is biodiversity loss. But most people couldn't guess the other one, that red wedge on the right-hand side of your screen. That's nitrogen. We've tripled the amount of nitrogen flowing through the planetary terrestrial biosphere, through grasslands and wetlands and farmlands and forests and jungles, tripled the flow of the most critical and shaping nutrient in the biosphere. And I would suggest, if we were not all so focused on the climate crisis, we'd all be talking about the nitrogen crisis. We are neck deep in a planetary nitrogen crisis. This is the global nitrogen fertilizer use, again, upward trending, double since 1980. So many of the molecules we push in addition to the atoms being indestructible, many of the molecules are persistent. For instance, we push plastic and microplastic. We push in plastic and it comes out as plastic and microplastic fragments. And you end up with things like oceans and wildlife full of plastic, and human food and water full of plastic. Here's a graph of production over the past century, 1919 to 2019. And you can see the smooth exponential growth there. We're up to about 500 million tons of plastic every year. Only a tiny fraction is recycled. That entire 500 million tons is ending up somewhere. I could give a lot more examples, a lot more molecules and atoms, but I think you get the idea. So let's just put this all in one graph. This is 250 years of material use, 1850 to 2100. So there's a projection outward to 2100. It looks a bit messy because it's assembled from 7 different data sets from the UN and OECD and peer-reviewed journals. But what it does is it sums up all of the material flows through the economy. So when I say material flows, it's everything other than water. It's oil and coal and wood and grain and steel and concrete, sand, diamonds, aluminum, gold. It's all the materials of our cities, of our electronics, of our houses, of our lives, everything except water. And I'll show you where we are now, that little oval. shows you where we are now. We're just shy of 100 billion tons per year, just short of 100 billion tons. Now, again, this is a linear system, so that everything goes in must come out. If we're at 100 billion tons per year, that's 1 trillion tons per decade. So business as usual, our government plans, our corporate plans, that plan is to push 1 trillion tons of materials into one end of our linear systems over the next decade, and that entire 1 trillion tons is going to come out the other end. And some of it's going to be benign, but a lot of it's not. And that entire 1 trillion tons is going to end up in our atmosphere, our oceans, and our landscape, or as I like to say, our landfills, sky fills, and sea fills. Everything ends up somewhere. Just to say a bit about energy, a little foundational understanding on energy. As you'll know, until about the 18th century, energy on Earth relied on solar power. And this is that same graph on CO2 in the atmosphere. And, you know, we think we know what that graph shows us, but if we think more deeply about it, it's going to reveal something different. You know, what's really happening in that graph? The underlying problem with our modern energy sources is that they have material carriers. It's not the energy in fossil fuels that's causing the problem right now. It's the materials that carry the energy, mostly the carbon atoms. So fossil fuel energy creates a carbon dioxide problem, a problem regarding the accumulation of materials, and those materials accumulate because these are linear systems. And we're not just extracting and releasing energy, we're extracting and releasing billions of tons of materials, billions of tons of carbon. So what you're seeing in that graph is a spent fuel problem. It's a spent fuel problem. And I would suggest we can generalize from that and say all energy sources that come with material carriers will cause us problems. So here you have a slide. In the upper right, you have the energy sources that do have material carriers: oil, coal, for sure, natural gas, but also nuclear and biomass. But the ones that don't have material carriers are solar and wind and hydroelectricity. And I suggest that it's those ones in the lower right, and of course hydroelectricity has to be looked at judiciously, but it's the ones in the lower right that we should probably look most closely at. Just moving toward the wrap up here, I want to say a few things about sustainability. I want to suggest that the definition of sustainability is one of the clearest things in the world. If you look at the definition, or the evidence rather, there's only one definition, and it's simple: sustainability equals circular plus solar. We know that because that is the pattern that enabled the biosphere to run for billions of years without any drawdown, without any toxic accumulation. It ran on circular flows of material powered by solar energy. And that was the dominant and largely inescapable pattern up until the last 100 to 200 years. And by replacing circular with linear and solar with fossil, we've created all the unsustainability problems that we now see. Again, here's the equation: sustainability equals circular plus solar. So what we have to do is not unclear. We just need to move back to those circular flows and solar energy. So just to end with a couple brief words, and all of you are the experts on pricing and levies. I am not, but just how they can support this move back towards circular flows and solar energy. I just included here a quote. I remember Stéphane Dion from 2006, and forgive my bad Stéphane Dion impression, but he said in Saskatoon, where I was at a meeting, he said, "We are going to tax you less on what you earn and more on what you burn." So this idea of tax shifting, it's one part of a necessary suite of solutions. And I would just say that in addition to levies and pricing on fossil fuels, we need those on all mined or harvested unrecycled materials such as wood, paper, iron, aluminum, etc. We need those kinds of levies and pricing to make sure costs are internalized on single-use, non-recyclable consumer goods, on fossil fuels, of course, but even things like fossil water and unsustainable use and depleting uses. So And of course, as you know, offsetting these levies and prices should be a robust system of rebates, dividends, or personal tax deductions or credits. So just to let you know where you can get more information on the agricultural emissions side of my talk, there's lots more information on the NFU.ca website. Tackling the farm crisis and the climate crisis is a good place to start. Just go to NFU.ca. And in terms of the shift from circular to linear systems, a lot of that information is detailed in my book from a couple of years ago, Civilization Critical. So thanks for this opportunity to speak to you. If there's a little bit of time, I'd be happy to take a few questions. And I will unshare my screen.
Darrin, that was amazing. I'm a big picture seer, and I truly appreciate the view that you've given us. We do have time, a couple questions, highly focused, very quick, if you can make them that way, because we have about 3 minutes. It is wonderful, and I'm so glad to have you back again here. But the big picture is so critical. So anybody, yeah, we have a question in the room here. So we'll give it over to Rainer.
Hi, Darrin. My name is Rainer Fehrenbacher. I'm from Abbotsford, British Columbia. It's a large farming community. The fact that petrochemical or the petro-extractive capitalism is such a boogeyman, which everyone here in the room knows, it's not. You find a lot of people in farming communities who are hesitant to any sort of philosophy that is critical of capitalism. Have you found any inroads in farming communities or ways to make that case to people? I mean, I guess the whole presentation was wonderful, but maybe other places too, where we could direct people to find resources.
Thanks very much for the question. And yeah, I know evoking that word creates a lot of questions, but maybe just a little distinction in that I don't think anyone wants to give up market economies. We want markets, we want freedom to act in those marketplaces. But the aspect of capitalism that is especially pernicious is this growth imperative, that no matter how much you produced on your farm, no matter how much fertilizer you use, no matter how big you are, you need to produce more, use more fertilizer and get bigger. So I think that's the part we need to shave off. We need to get people off this treadmill of maximizing yield by maximizing inputs, which means maximizing emissions, and move to something that recognizes some care and perhaps even limits around this.
It was a great question and a great answer. One more in the room. Let me fast, right, honey?
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. My dad, of course, was an agricultural scientist, an IBC scientist. He talked about nitrogen years ago. The question always comes up is, can we produce enough food? This is a very basic question, but I just want to get it across. Can we produce enough food for the world without using these linear systems?
Great question, and that needs to be our starting point. We want to reduce hunger, not increase it. But as many of you will know, we're currently doing a lot of very unwise things with our food. We're lighting a lot of it on fire to drive vehicles through biofuels. We're wasting a lot. The number that you often hear in Canada is 40%, which it may not be quite that much, but it's a significant fraction of that. And then we're doing a lot of other unwise things in terms of producing colas and soda pop, Cheetos, corn puffs, what I call nutritionally disfigured foods. We're taking nutritious food and turning them into things that, cause illness and ill health. So we should probably treat that food with a bit more reverence and not do unwise things with it. And then I think there'd be a lot more to feed the people that need to be fed, and we wouldn't constantly have to produce more in order to burn and waste more.
Excellent answer. It is noon. We have 5 minutes to the next, but I don't know if you can get that last question from Tom if you want, or if you want to leave now, that's okay. It looks like it's a really fast question, or we can stop right now, whatever you wish, Darrin. I always
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, Within the design and building and architecture arena, the premise of cradle to cradle has become quite popular. Is this consistent with your thoughts?
I think it really is. We need to build in circularity, and electric vehicle batteries right now is a clear and pressing need for that, and in building materials as well. I have to say, I think there's currently more talk of these things than there is effective action around these things. So at least we're discussing it, but I don't think yet that it's a significant force on the landscape. But yeah, I think we need to implement those solutions and make sure everything we put out into the world is designed to come back into that loop.
Thank you so much, Darrin. You've given us both a spatial and temporal overview of the grand system that we have to keep in balance here as human beings. So I thank you again, and I look forward to working with you in the future as well.
Thank you.